Hello, my name is Carol May Whittick, and welcome to Her Conversations, Tools for the Awakening Woman. Her is an acronym for Higher Energetic Resonance. This is the optimal state to embody in order to attract our highest desires. Who is the awakening woman? She is the woman who's seeking a greater possibility in her reality and looking for solutions. She knows being awakened is not a lofty ideal, but a necessity. If she can transform herself, she can change the world. Her conversations will introduce you to talented women who speak to your spirituality, sensuality, and soul. They share their stories and explain how they are in service to the world. So let their words and these conversations embolden and inspire you. My guest on this week's Her Conversations is holistic executive coach and founder of the culture shift agency, Marla Teyolia. Her work is centred on creating a sacred space for women of colour to facilitate their healing and transformation. During our conversation, we discuss why there's still a need for separate healing spaces. Marla also shares why it's necessary to know that our coaches and leaders are continually doing work on themselves, and she offers guidance for coaches about finding their core niche and the correct price point relative to their preferred client and their experience. But as always, I begin by asking my guests, Her is an acronym for Higher Energetic Resonance. When do you feel you're most her?
I feel the most her when I am in circles of women. When either as a participant in a retreat or facilitating a retreat, it could be a sister circle, something that's more impromptu in my home. But really, when I'm surrounded by women and there's an intentional gathering of some sort for us to connect and convene, that's when I feel most powerful and where I feel that I'm able to harness my own energy and feel that my energy is elevating.
That's beautiful. Do you know what? Relating to that, and as you said that, I had a conversation yesterday with somebody who is still, and I think from my point of view, I'm obviously, you're preaching to the choir. I'm in this kind of environment where I'm speaking to women like yourself. I'm asking them this question and they have an answer to it. What I fail to realize is the majority of women don't feel this way at all. And it totally, it kind of surprised me I knew that, I knew it was still out there. And for me, it took many years, before I started to move in circles where I felt safe around the women that I was with, because there was no agenda. And then that's how I felt confident to kind of build her and start to speak and reach out to women. And then because I'm speaking to so many, I'm in this kind of like fairy tale of what's going on, forgetting that we are still really in a minority. And it just kind of really reminded me. And when you said that, I'm like, of course, but
it's critical.
We're so needed here, because the thing is the what I'm doing and the work that we're doing, and we feel that it's so vast. It really is so small, because to many women still it's a fairy tale.
No, it's true. I once had a client, I do this program called Ignite Your Shift, and it begins with a weekend immersion, and that sets off a 3 to 6 month journey individually, but there's also collective that participates in the retreat. And I had one client who came to that really feeling that she didn't have a community of women, a tribe that was really reflective of where she was and where she wanted to go. And had a lot of sadness and a lot of real limiting beliefs that she was never going to find it, right? Because that wasn't her experience, to your point. That wasn't what was readily available to her. And when I tell you, a year and a half later, this group of women is still so deeply connected. They created a sisterhood through that weekend immersion, and it wasn't even necessarily my plan that afterwards they created a WhatsApp group. That group is in communication and alive and well over a year and a half later, because we all needed that kind of support and felt that, I found my people, right? I found people who are on a similar path. And for me, the work that I do is about connecting you to be able to then connect to others and have impact, right? And it was interesting to your point around people not necessarily in general thinking that in the ethos that it's like, I need to have this strong group of women. There was a research that came out from Northwestern University. I believe it was published this last either January or February. And it was talking about women who reach higher levels of success within organizations. And I want to say that this was looking at the business kind of corporate sector.
Mm-hmm.
The differentiating factor for women who've achieved those levels has been that they have a group of women that they turn to for support, that it's a real intentional group. And it actually doesn't matter how well connected the members of that group are.
Mm-hmm.
If you have well connected members in your sister circle, you might learn of more opportunities or things of that nature. But all that matters is that you actually have a sister circle, because what you do is you turn to them for support and guidance and a reprieve in terms of how to navigate really male dominated spaces.
Yeah.
And for the men, did not matter. Their group could be multiple genders. It didn't matter. That was not necessarily one of the defining factors that took them to their next level.
Isn't it interesting?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just like this. It's one of those things where it's a yearning that you don't even know that you have until you kind of get into, and you realize that was the part that was missing, and that then, like you say, you flourish and everything like that. But it's something that is still really fresh at the back of my mind. I'm like, man, it's like it's so much for us to do, and so much for us to continue to create and put out into the world. And talking about your work, how did you move into the work that you do and creating the retreats and the projects that you have?
You know, it's interesting. I love this question because it helps me reflect on my journey, right? And I think sometimes when we're in our journey, or we've had what we might have seen as pit stops or detours in our journey, when you're able to look back with the wisdom of, several decades, you're able to say, oh, actually, that all made perfect sense, right? So I started doing women's work really in college, at university here in the United States. And I signed up for an internship with a psychology professor, and we were to go into shelter for survivors of domestic abuse and provide support. And through that process, I ended up working in the domestic violence space for several years. And one of my first, if not the first, circle that I had facilitated on my own. It was an evening circle, I'll never forget. We were in a safe house. It was an evening circle. And this woman came in that day fully battered, right? Fully beat and bruised up and bloody. And she was in the circle that night. And she was sitting next to me. And I remember just holding space and for the stories and for the sharing. And going home that evening, and it was in the Bay Area, and it was a safe house in San Francisco, and I lived in Berkeley. And if you've ever been to the Bay, it's a long Bay Bridge, right? So I was way deep in San Francisco and making my way home. And I remember just being so deeply impacted, not only by the stories, but also the physicality of what I was witnessing. And I was crying on the way home. And I remember very distinctly sobbing on the bridge at night. And by the time I got to the end of the bridge, there was awareness of, Marla, you cannot continue to let the stories impact you so deeply, or you will not be able to be of service. Like, you have to take care of yourself. And the tears stopped. And it was this moment of divine intervention around self-care, that in order to do what you are here to do, you have to deeply tend to your spirit, deeply tend to your heart, to make sure that you can have the greatest impact, right? And that doesn't mean hardening ourselves off. So I continued in that space for many years and worked in pregnancy, not so much prevention, but I worked with young pregnant minors, high schoolers and teenagers in San Francisco, and decided to go to grad school because I really was working in a social work space and didn't see too many women of color in leadership positions, really. We were a lot of the frontline workers. And there were definitely middle managers, right, of women of color, but not really in the top leadership. And so I went to Columbia University for social work. And it was one of the, I would say, really big moments for me around the impact of race and the intersection of our identities and what that can do to someone's mental health. So I have been somebody that was really academic from a really young age, right? So I was valedictorian. I was always top of the class. I was involved in multiple activities. And I share that just to say, to give you context around what happened when I went to Columbia. So I've always felt very strong in my power around in educational spaces. And so when I went to Columbia, I was one of very few Latinas, women of color, but specifically Mexican, right? Because I'm from California. And at that time in New York, this was in the mid 90s or early 90s, Mexicans were a very new immigrant group there in New York. And so there weren't a lot of the cultural foods or, there's a way, if you've been to California, Mexican culture is very much a tapestry woven underneath the culture of California. So you hear the language all the time. Our foods are very present, burritos, tacos. And in New York, there wasn't that, right? So a burrito was $7 and it was like awful. And I was like, oh my God, I'm a grad student and I have a few dollars here to spend on this meal. But what was really happening in the classroom was that academically, while I still was running circles around people, there was a lot of microaggressions towards me as a woman of color from the white women in the space. And it was a very white woman space. And so women had gone into this field to, quote, help, but there was a real charity mindset, or that I'm helping these brown and Black young people kind of pick themselves up from their bootstraps. And here's somebody who is disrupting my thought because she's a really educated Latina who actually is performing better than me in class, right? So I was having a lot of micro and real and some not so microaggressions towards me. And it was deeply impacting my spirit. So 6 months in, I realized I was starting to feel depressed. I was having anxiety. I lived in Brooklyn, had to commute to Harlem, and that was like an hour commute. So by the time I got to my internship, because it was a very internship heavy education, I was exhausted from being in really it felt like a sardine in the subway, right? So energetically, I was picking up so much and didn't know how to take care, protect myself, right? And so I give thanks for an elder by the name of Vasana Makaru that my then boyfriend now has been introduced me to. And she was an elder who lived in San Francisco who did a lot of spiritual work. And he said, I think you should call her. Do you want her number? And I said, fine, I'll call her. I felt at my wit's end. And I called her. And one of the first things, so she's a healer, depending on what your cosmology is, she's kind of a healer and a spiritualist and can help communicate with energies around you. So she has me say my name. And the first thing she tells me is, your ancestors have been calling. And I just started sobbing. And it was a moment for me around, you have to return to your culture. You have to, in the midst of a space that doesn't see your wholeness, you have to return to things that will make you whole. And so so this was like 96, I believe. And so she said, I need for you to create an altar in your room and to sit and meditate every day. And at that point I was like, okay, I don't really know if I'm doing this right. I'm just sitting here. All I'm doing is thinking the entire time. But what ended up happening was that became my spiritual armor. So I wouldn't even leave the house to go to the bodega without really harnessing my power in the morning and creating this bubble of protection for myself and really elevating my energy. And from there, I think once you take one step, things begin to unfold. I discovered, I'd taken some yoga classes in college, but it never stuck. And I discovered yoga and went deeper into meditation, and I became vegan. And so there was a way in which I was energetically, like from what was external, I was being able to harness my own energy. And I was also then cleansing myself internally, right? And so all of that created a situation that by the end of, I would say maybe 8 months later, I felt so much more deeply powerful, right? I had harnessed my power and I felt, okay, nothing else from the exterior had changed, but I felt powerful. And that became my journey around how do you help support people to access their power so they can continue to do what they're here to do, right? And so that's evolved, and I can go through many ways. It's evolved over the years. I've gone through training, and I'm a coach, an executive coach. I call my work holistic executive coach because I don't just teach skill set building that is necessary in the workplace. I also work with women to do those internal shifts, because leadership development cannot happen in a way that's sustainable if you haven't done the internal work. It'll lie flat, and it will not be alive in that space. So that has really been, I would say, the beginnings of my work, and it has evolved over time so that who I am is very much infused in the work, right? So I start off saying, I feel more powerful circles of women, so I need to have some retreats in my life. So therefore it became like, let me then create those spaces for women. And so I use ritual to really help bypass the brain, move into the heart, move into the cell, move into our DNA, to be able to integrate mind, body, spirit, to activate your power, to have impact.
So important. And I like what you say about when you're stepping into positions of leadership, it's very much about being a leader of yourself already, because you're going to get pushed from left to right. You're going to get judged. You're going to get questioned. And if you don't have that point where you know who you are, and then also you don't have that dialogue of meditation, of some sort of spiritual connection to your ancestors or whatever you want to call it, you are going to get knocked over. You are, and talking back to that incident that I led with earlier, if I think about other creative endeavors that I've tried over the years, and it's been times when I've not necessarily had such a deep spiritual practice. I've always believed, but I've never been so into it on a daily basis. It's been very easy for someone to come at me from the outside and just literally just tell me what I'm doing is an absolute waste of time and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And just get knocked over by that, even though it's my idea. And if I close my eyes, I can see it and feel it and taste it. And yet one random voice can push me over. And what I really felt from, especially when I woke up this morning and like thought back about it and just thought, it's just like, it just means I'm going to hold on tighter. It just means I'm going to put the foot to the pedal a little bit more, because I know it's important. I know where it's coming from. I know also, even though I'm in this kind of small group of sisterhood of women that I'm speaking to all over, I'm hearing the same thing repeated again and again, and how much it means to them, how much they understand the her, and how useful the work that they're doing and what they've come out of, and the fact that they've come out of whatever their story is or whatever their pain is, and they've transformed it, and then they're able to pay it forward. And usually the people who don't get it at this point haven't reached that point within themselves where they don't understand why I'm doing something that doesn't make any sense. More importantly, doesn't make any money. It must be crazy, you know what I mean, at this point in time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, the money will come, right? And that's one of the things that I had to really do my own limiting belief work around, right? So I have always really surrounded myself with women of color, been in circles of women of color. And sometimes those circles have been very diverse with white women in this space, but they've been women of color centric. And so, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I had begun building Culture Shift Agency, the agency that I founded. And at that point, I co-founded it with another woman, and she's an amazing woman. And she's an older white woman. And we were doing a lot of kind of women's empowerment work and leadership development work. And we were crafting the business, right? And we were looking at what the vision of the business was, what our values were, what our programming was. And one of the things that became really clear was that our true norths were slightly different, right? My work was really wanting to be women of color focused, retreat focused, coaching focused, really holistic. And her work was really wanting to be organizational focused. And at that time, when we were, we really worked together for a year and trying to flesh this out. And when that year came full circle, there was a moment where I was working with a coach, because I think it's really important for everybody to get support, even right, even if I'm a coach, to get coaching. And she asked me some really great questions, because at that point I was just having some challenges with the website. I felt like when you came in, it felt confusing. Like there were so many ways, like, are we operating for businesses? Are we doing organizations? Are we doing retreats? Like it all felt like there were too many visions in the space, right? And so she asked me some really great questions. And she said, Marla, if tomorrow you were 100% booked with just individual coaching clients, would you be happy? And I said, no. Like, I love the individual work, but I know that I love the retreat work. Okay, so if you were just doing retreats, would you be happy? And I was like, well, yeah, I think I would definitely be happier, but I feel the pull of organizational work because we price the organizational work so much higher, right? And so she's like, okay, well, if you were just doing organizational work, and I was like, no, if I was just doing organizational work, that wouldn't work for me either. So she says, listen, if you have priced if your vision and your passion project is not at the higher price point, and you don't create a program that is absolutely delicious for you, that you are super excited about, it is always going to play second fiddle to the one that you priced higher. Right. And it was an aha moment. Right. So I took this information back to my then partner, and what became clear was that we had competing visions. And there was a moment where, with so much love for each other, we said, we're playing it safe here with each other. I actually have to go do this with women of color, and I'm scared shitless, excuse my language, because I'm afraid that women of color aren't going to pay for this. And she said, I really want to focus in on the organizational work, and I already have this methodology I want to work with. Like, yes. So we parted ways really amicably, and it was really scary for me because I had to confront the belief that I didn't think women of color were going to fully support it. And when I tell you, the next day, I got my first coaching client through that agency, just picked up the phone, and it was a woman of color who said, I need coaching. Will you help me? And from that, then the floodgates opened. But it was a moment of really standing really firmly with what it is that brings you the biggest amount of joy, the biggest amount of passion. Where do you feel the most powerful? And I know what my gifts are, and I know how to create sacred space for women that creates transformation. Like, I know that that's something that is a gift of mine. And so to really then craft a business around that has been such a blessing and an honor. And not that there isn't work, and not that there isn't days where I'm like, okay, breathe, right? Release fear. But the reality is, I know that I am making an impact in the way that I am supposed to be making an impact.
So good. I want to ask you more about the belief, and it probably comes you said it, and I heard echoes of me going, yeah, that's kind of where my head comes from as well, is the belief that women of color are not prepared to invest in coaching, or able to invest in coaching as well, or any kind of like spiritual work for themselves. I was just recently, literally as I was switching on from you, I was watching a panel of one of my yoga teachers, Guru Jagat, and it was about one of the panelists was talking about how, when she's setting up her business and working predominantly with people of color, that belief of they're always going to want a discount, they're not going to want to pay, they're not going to want to support, that kind of thing, and it's, or they just want to go for the celebrity thing. You know what I mean? It's like when it's like a person that they know, when it's an individual, a small business, a sole entrepreneur, that they're not prepared to do that. It's like, why do we have this? Where does that come from? Why do we believe it's true, do you think?
Right. I mean, I think for me is that, one, there's economics, right? I think that there is a reality around communities of color not having as many resources. So that is a real economic reality. I think there's also a larger reality that the wellness industry has never catered to us. We've never been marketed to. And the reality is that we do actually are spenders, and we will purchase things that we find a value for ourselves, right? So I think traditionally we, as people of color, and I can speak really from a Western perspective of the United States, we have been those who've been in servitude, the workers, the nannies, the mammies, the food pickers. So we've always been viewed collectively as being in service to white men and white women. Mm-hmm. And so the psyche of wellness as a culture has not been one that I think has been extended to us. And the industry is slowly waking up to that. And yet there's the commodification of that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's incredibly important that if that is your value. So for me, women of color and helping and creating spaces for women of color to rise is one of my deepest core values. And so I know that it's coming from such a deep, authentic place for me. And then it is about finding who you are speaking to, right? So I am speaking to women of color in general. And then I know that my services are targeted to a piece of that population that are high achieving women who have certain levels of education that have the resources to pay. Right. And I didn't necessarily believe that those groups existed in large numbers, but we do. Right. And that's something that I think that we also have to see, what Kool-Aid have we drunk around the stereotypes we might hold around our communities. Mm-hmm. Right. And that for me became really, I would say, full force when I made the decisions that I have to create a program for women of color that is it's called a point of no return program, right? Where when you go to that program, you will be forever changed. Like you can never go back to an older way of being, right? Because that is something that was gifted to me many, many years ago. And I was forever different and forever shifted and forever changed. And once I got clear that that's what I needed to do, and I stepped boldly in that, the reality is that women of color, we need it. And they were like, where, oh my God, I haven't seen programs that have been specifically for me. So all of a sudden the floodgates opened, right? So I think there's multiple forces that are at play for that dynamic. And then we have to look at ourselves and peel back the layers of what our own colonization has been like, what our own internalized racism or biases have been like, and what have we believed. And the reality is that there are some people who are not going to be able to afford it, and that may not be your people, unless that is specifically the group that you're trying to connect with, and then you're creating a business or a nonprofit to get more support from other sources to do that, right? And so all of those are valid, but the reality is that the needs are great.
Yeah.
Amongst all, economic stratas of our communities.
Yeah. I hear you. And it's interesting how invisible to me, let me speak from my point of view, invisible to me that affluent women of color sector has been. It might be one or two women that kind of turn up in the business pages as high achievers or anything like that, but on a mass level, like you say, as a core group of women that are just kind of getting on with their lives and not seeing anywhere that they can be served or not being represented as a whole, because we know what wellness looks like on social media. Up until this point in particular, we know what it's always looked like, and those areas are being kind of opened, and there's a big conversation about it, especially online. And if you've kind of like been caught up in the way that the whole conversation is coming to the fore now, and everyone's voicing their opinion, and there's a lot of ignorance around it, I think on all sides, really, not just from women of color who are not aware, but also from white women who don't realize how much they've benefited from privilege.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think that it's important to note, what can people give, right? So for example, I do open up slots for scholarships in my retreats and in my coaching, right? And those stay very under the radar. And it's usually people who are reached out and I want to do this and I can't afford it. And then we'll have this conversation once we find if we're a good fit, right? And then I also know that you will find a way that there's a reorganization of priorities if this is something that is even somewhat closer to your realm, right? So we're going to have a segment of the population where it is completely out of the realm, that it's real hand to mouth. And then we're going to have folks that it's like, okay, I'm working, I don't have a lot of money, but I could maybe try to, maybe I'm not necessarily buying those shoes, or I'm buying that bag, or right? Like I'm prioritizing differently. And I know for me, my wellness has been something that has been a priority in the times where I have had absolutely limited cash, right? So I was thinking about this the other day. So I became vegan, as I was sharing, I think in 96, right? So I was vegan for about 13 years before my children were born. And my husband is an artist. And, at that point, he was an artist, I was a social worker. Neither one of us had chosen professions that were like these high-powered, real big money makers from the get-go, right? So we really struggled financially. But the biggest thing was that when I launched my business, because I at that point also had an artist management business, it was, my freedom is so important to me, right? And I created a business that was really to support my own freedom, even though financially it was tight. And I'll never forget, this may not have been the wisest economic choice, but we didn't have very much money in the bank. And I went and spent, $150 maybe out of the $250 that was left in the bank at the end of the month on a juicer. And he comes over and was like, you really spent it on this juicer. And this was like 96. And I said, well, yeah, like I have to do this cleanse. Like and so it was a point for me where I realized what was more important was that I had to take care of my health. We'd already paid all the bills. There was a little bit of money left, and I made the investment. And that investment just came back to me over and over again because I was so available to do my work, and I was so healthy and so vibrant. And so I was attracting what it was that I wanted, but I had to invest. And so when I've had coaches, I've invested in coaches that have been real high quality with a high price point because I felt that they were giving me the best that I needed at that time. And I found a way to make it work. And so with women who I know may not be able to drop the full payment, I always do payment plans. And I don't charge more for payment plans. Some people do. Like I don't penalize in that way. I have never had somebody not pay. And sometimes my programs are 6 months and we might do the payment plan over 10 months. And I've never had somebody those last 4 months where we're actually not in the program anymore not pay because we've created this real sacred relationship with each other, right? It's become a real sacred space. And so I really do believe in creating those kind of relationships where we're there to support each other and in ways that feel immersive and deeply respectful.
That's great. I want to ask you about pricing, and it's not necessary for you to say what your pricing is, but especially as somebody who's setting themselves up in a coaching practice and then thinking about this is what I want in return for my services because this is how I'm going to be able to transform it and this is what I believe it to be of value. How did you get to the point where you settled into what you felt was right about that? Because I know that people are listening and they're trying to price it, and it's a number that you can pick out of the sky, and sometimes if you go too low, you're not going to get the right person, and then when you go higher, it's like then you might be stepping out of where you feel you're ready to go when you're going higher, even though there are people out there who have high ticket packages and get the high ticket clients with no problem.
Absolutely. Right. Now, this is a great question. So this is something that I personally struggled with when I first set out. And again, that very masterful coach. So I had created a proposal for an organization, and it was a corporation that I will not name, but a very powerful corporation with a lot of money. So I was really freaked out. What do I even price, right? What is this? So at first I did my due diligence around talking to friends in corporations who'd had retreats happen for them and things like that. What was a general number, right? And then I really did something that was really stretched myself, right? My coach at that time, she said, listen, I have clients that charge $5,000 a day for a corporation, $1,000 a day. I have clients that charge $30,000 a day, and they all give value. It is about what can you hold, right? Because really the conversation is about what can you hold,
for sure,
right?
yeah.
What can you accept? And part of the story is that once I made this big leap for myself. I submitted this proposal. When I tell you that every single moment I kept on checking my phone because I thought that they were going to say no, it was really fascinating to witness how paralyzed I was. And by the end of the week, when I spoke to the person, she was like, oh yeah, I got your invoice. We're good. And it was a moment of like, it wasn't a big deal for her, right? Like it was just like, oh yeah, I submitted it. We're good. But it was about what I could hold, right? So I'd created all this anxiety for myself. When you're thinking about what you can hold, I think it's really important to have a really honest and transparent conversation with yourself around what you're bringing and the experience you're bringing to the table, right? Because where I am now, as I mentioned, my journey started in 96. I've been doing this for over 20 years. So I feel deeply confident in the level of mastery that I'm providing. Right? There's 20 years of experience that I have that I feel you're not getting somebody who just started. Right? And I think everybody has to have that conversation with themselves. What are the real skills that you're bringing? What is the experience that you're bringing to the table? And allow that to inform your price point as well, right? Because I've been and experienced programs where this isn't to take away anything because there's value. However, I'm saying, the depth of experience and real practice isn't fully there yet, right? So you have to make sure that what you're providing service that is of deep value, that you are living, that you're breathing, and that you are fully harnessed and steeped in, right? Because I don't want to necessarily be supported by somebody who's like building the car as they're going, right? Like I need to actually feel deeply held in that space. And so I would say that's the biggest conversation to have is what do you think you can hold? And yes, do your due diligence around what's in the marketplace, right? So for example, with my rates are very different. Some corporations just set the rates, right? And that's very different than what I'm going to charge an individual woman who's paying on her own. And I am not one of the high, if you think of coaching, my price point, I would say is right somewhere in the middle because I do recognize that it still feels like a lot, right? And I am okay with that. But what that means is that I actually take on a small number of individual clients that are paying at the level that is the one that I'm setting. I look to take on a little bit more of the corporate clients because it allows me to offset, right? So that's a very, I would say, personal conversation for each person to have with themselves and doing the work, because at the end of the day, I do believe that you do have to price at a way that does feel like a stretch for you. Right? That isn't egregious, but does feel like a stretch for you, and also could be a stretch for your clients. Because if you are providing something that's free or low cost, people in our capitalistic society do not see it as highest value. And that is just real. Okay? That has been my experience, and it's real. So you have to decide for yourself what that point is. And like my girlfriend said, my coach / girlfriend said, I have clients who charge $1,000 or $5,000 a day. I have clients who charge $30,000. And to be honest, they all provide really damn good value. So you've got to figure out where it is, what you can hold.
When you do that stretch, is it, you would do, well, I want to ask a question previous to that as well. Do you believe part of it was coming from being a woman of colour and looking at the numbers. Was that something that related to what your background was, whether there was kind of like financial issues in your background, or was it just because you were moving into that space and it seems like an open field?
Right. I think, that's a great question. Because initially I was working in the space of not necessarily focusing on the corporate work. It was the individual work. I wanted to price it at a way that honored the level of my experience and honored what I felt reasonable and good. Right. And that's where I think you have to check in with your body. So for me, when I check in and I say, okay, I'm going to charge X dollars, I really sit with, how does it feel energetically in me? Is it making me like go into panic because it feels way too over? Or does it feel like, okay, that one actually sits right? Or is it like, oh yeah, no, that's way too cheap, right? Like you've got to check in. And I do think that in that checking in, it's all about our money stories, right? It's all around what we feel is possible for us. It's all around what it was that you learned as a child. And so you have to do that work, right? And so that's why I think it's actually really helpful for people who are starting businesses to get coaches, right? Like to get a coach who's going to help you walk you through that process, right? So that you can be held and that you can experience what it's like from the consumer end to make an investment and what it's like to be coached, right? Like you've got to hold all sides of that. And so for me, I don't teach something that has not been proven true for me through my own lived experience. In the skill set building component of my work, I gravitate to what it is that I know that works because I've tried it, right? And I think that I can speak confidently about something if I have been able to embody it myself, right? Because if not, then it's something I read from a book, and that doesn't really, for me personally, hold weight. And so the teachers that I have gone to experience, I'll share with you one. Her name is Tracy Stanley. She's an amazing yoga nidra teacher who's been doing this for 20 years. The first time I worked with Tracy, it was a weekend immersion. And I left that weekend feeling so deeply held. And it was the first time in a really, really long time that I had felt held by someone that I feel had the lived experience and the depth that I needed to fully surrender. And there was a moment where I realized, oh, this is what my clients are experiencing. Because I'm giving this, I've been doing this for 20 some years. This is what they're experiencing. So to be able to have someone who's been doing something for 20 some years, is so deeply steeped in her purpose and her dharma and shares yoga nidra so powerfully and so beautifully, to have that experience was such a gift for me, because I could see, oh, this is what I need. This is why XYZ doesn't resonate with me in other courses, because I'm not getting that depth of someone who's deeply living it. Right? And you energetically can tell. And so really trusting yourself. So when I know that, I do calls where I will do a 30-minute complimentary call with me that I'll actually be opening up in the next week or two for new clients. And, when women are talking to me and they're going to shop around and go see other people, I'm like, do that. Go see as many people, take as many calls, because you have to feel good, because you're entering into a sacred relationship. And that's really how I hold my coaching, whether people are coming for me for life coaching, whether they're coming for executive coaching, for business coaching. It's a sacred relationship. And you have got to feel that you can be held in that space, that you are going to learn in that space, that you can bring the totality and the wholeness of who you are into that space, even in your brokenness, that you can bring all those pieces. And you want somebody who's skilled to help you you are bringing yourself back together, right? Like, I'm not empowering you. You're empowering you. I'm creating the space for that to happen. But you're the one who's doing the work.
So beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tracy is someone that's on my radar actually as well. I'm really just enjoying her from afar, really, because I haven't actually met her at all. But yeah, I can see it just comes off the page when you're talking about energy. I know we're kind of like using technology, which is kind of like feels cold and hard. But I find a lot of the time that as cold and hard and as clinical as technology may be, it does allow for you to feel into people. I mean, we're speaking across, technology, but yeah, I know when it's working and I know when it's not working for me. I've had conversations that flow and ones where it's like I'm really kind of like winding it through. And then also I've had coaching experiences too, where I've felt that somebody was like, they're on the phone to me, but they may have been doing something else at the time. I think they might have been cooking their dinner or something like that. And that has been disappointing. And that was one of my earliest experiences as well, where I was like, I don't know what to do here. And I had to contact a friend and going like, is it possible to sack your coach? Because this isn't working. That's what I realized. It got to the point where I was paying I was doubling my outgoings. I was paying as much as I was paying for my accommodation because I wanted to get something out of it, and it just didn't work. And I was nervous about where I stood as a client in the whole relationship as well. And I think for me as a newbie, just stepping into a one-on-one relationship, like you say, sacred relationship, I didn't realize how much say that I had in it as well, because I very much kind of went in there going, here's my money and here's me, and I'll just kind of do as I say. So that was a big learning experience for me also, in terms of what my position was as the client.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to be a client, right? To actually go and experience, how do other people do it? How are they holding space? What resonates with you? What doesn't resonate with you, right? Because while I think that, yes, we need more coaches and mentors and people to support and hold space, the flip side of that is that my concern is that people aren't really doing the deep work that they need to do to be able to hold space, right? So all of a sudden it's like, oh, I have my certification and that, quote, entitles me to be good. And that's not the case, right? Experience does that. Doing the work does that. Going deep does that, right? But you can't buy your way through. Right. And so that is so egregious that you would have a coach to be sitting there cooking with you. Right. And
I remember hearing it. It was like, okay, the tap's going, and I'm like, is she chewing ice? It just felt like there was just like all of these things, and it was just
absolutely,
and coming away from the whole thing, just thinking, I'm like, stretching myself financially, because I really believe that at the end of this 6 months, I'm going to be in a different place. And as it was 3/4 of the way through, I'm like kind of like changing all my cards and like pushing money out of accounts so it doesn't get taken. Because if I defaulted on our meeting, like the agreements of our meeting, if I didn't do the work in between our sessions, it would be on me. And yet I didn't feel they were doing the work, as in giving me their full attention for that hour or so. And, and I just kind of felt like I was almost intruding in on their time.
Yeah, no. And I think, when we go back to this idea of sacredness, right, I would encourage people to ask, what are your practices, right? Like, what are the practices that you use to ground? What are the practices you use to prepare for sessions, right? So I meditate before my sessions, right? I sage before my sessions. I really try to envision every day that I can be of service in the best way possible, right? So when you talked about technology and this idea of like there's a tool that we have now, right, that can feel cold and impersonal, but yet at the same time, it can actually bring you closer together, right? So I do all of mine, except for anybody who actually lives in Atlanta, I'll do in person. I do all of my coaching on video conference, right? So over different platforms. And for me, it's critical to actually see somebody. Right. So one of my gifts is I energetically can feel when you have gotten to a deep place of truth. Like, it is a full energetic swoosh. Like, and I don't know how to explain it other than I literally feel it overtake my body. Right. there's information that a client shares verbally, but then there's information that she's sharing non-verbally she's not even aware of, right? Sure. So I'll give you an example. There was a sister that I was coaching, and we were working on a relationship, and she has her own business. She's very successful, and she was really looking to craft new partnerships. She had been divorced and was really had healed off of that. And what was interesting was that, so really calm, very self-possessed, very grounded. As soon as we started talking about relationships, what would happen to her body was really fascinating to witness, right? She would start squirming. She'd back away from the camera on the computer. Her hand would start, she would start moving around, and you could tell it completely took her off center, right? And so all this information for me as a coach was really incredibly important, because if I was not looking at her, I would not see that, right? Because I would just hear her voice. It still sounded grounded, but yet physically what was happening was clearly taking her off her center, right? And so the work, in order for it to be really sustainable and real transformative, has to be an embodied experience, right? That you're really beginning to reprogram those parts of your body, because your body's giving you information of how much anxiety that was creating for her, right? Because it was fascinating to witness. It was almost as if you just turned on a light switch and she began really fidgety, right? Mm-hmm. So I share that because I think it's important to find out, how do those coaches work, right? What are the ways of knowing that they lean into? What are their own gifts? How are they holding space? What are the tools and resources, right, that they're using to be able to deeply support you? Okay. So video conference for me is one of them, because I really want to physically see you, right? See what's happening to you, because I will witness and observe, and many times they're not conscious of it. So my role is to say, okay, let's pause. Did you notice X, Y, and Z that just happened? They don't. Okay, what's that about? Right? And then we can use that as another layer of peeling back of information. Because the work for me is deeply grounded in what are you holding in a real deep cellular place that informs your thought processes, that informs behavior, right? So many times when we want to change our lives, or we want to up level or do all of these things, we want to shift behaviors. And behaviors are critical, because behaviors inform your habits, and those habits really create the structure of your life, right? However, if you just make the intervention on the level of behaviors, you're missing a huge component, right? So sometimes people will come in and they say, I need to up my self-care, and they want us to just create a self-care plan, right? I guarantee you that if we just did that level of work, the moment you fall off your plan, which will probably happen within a day or two, that moment, the house of cards falls, and you either won't do it, you'll off for the week, or you might just stop it, right? The work that I engage with my clients is what is preceding the behavior. Because there's always a tape happening for us. What are the thoughts? What are the feelings? What is that mental processes that's happening, that physical processes that's happening that informs the behavior? Because once we can begin to make a change on that absolutely transforms the conversation, right? And so interventions have to happen at another level within the coaching space. So, I would tell you and your reader, be careful of people who are just operating on the doing, right? Because we know how to do that. The doing is not it. It's the being aspect that we need to really focus in on. And that is where you can set the stage for sustainable transformation.
Thank you for that, Seth.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I just wanted to ask you about the retreats that you're doing. The retreats, you say, mix women, white women and women of color together, and what are you noticing in terms of the interaction, and also as we are moving through these times where women of color are feeling that they're being more visible, that they're being more heard, and white women are appreciating and noticing the revelation of, one, that there are women of color that are able to step into these spaces, that want to be in these spaces, and also what they've been through, and hearing them, and maybe ways that they have not intentionally, but the system is set up for them to be benefiting from their privilege, and how is that playing out in the spaces that you hold?
Well, I actually don't hold those spaces.
Okay.
My retreats are only for women of color.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So a retreat that I do every year is called Pause and Press Play. I have a great partner in wellness named Crystal McCreary. She's a fabulous yoga teacher, mindfulness teacher, and educator. And she and I hold this retreat every year. This year it's happening at the Garrison Institute in upstate New York, so in the Hudson Valley. On June 21st to the 23rd. And it's yoga, mindfulness, ritual, nature, sisterhood, and play, right? It's really a place for us to connect and exhale, and have some pause. And we do some transformational work and some releasing and uncovering. But the real premise is play. For corporate work, I do those spaces, right? I do hold space for everybody in that space. And I enjoy those as well. I find that the retreat, when we're getting into a space where we're really needing to unpack and do some healing, it's really good to have those spaces be people of color spaces only, because it removes a layer of trigger. It removes a layer of protection that sometimes we feel that we have to operate in. And so my commitment is to hold that. Now, in June, on June 2nd, I'll be in London, and we're going to be doing a self-care event with yoga and meditation and journaling and ritual. And that will be, we're not marketing it just for women of color. It is 2 women of color leading it. So we'll see who shows up. But we do hold those spaces for that conversation. And it depends on where it comes from, right? So for example, like in the June event, we're not making it a racial healing event, right? Like if something comes up, we will navigate that space and we'll create group agreements around how we want to operate in the space and what you need to feel safe in this space. So we allow the group to define that for themselves. But unless I'm actually holding a group that's real intentional around having these conversations around race, we may not have that conversation if it isn't something that we've put forth, because I do feel people need to opt in to that conversation, right? Like it's not fair to anybody to have a conversation. It's always an invitation, and you get to define your boundaries around that. Right. And I think that there are very well seasoned practitioners who do that work, and that is their life's work. Right. My life's work is very much centered around women of color.
And do you see a time that you're going to change, or you're just going to stay working?
I think it'll be, I'm allowing it to emerge. My corporate work is very much for all women. I encourage corporations to think about the woman of color, because the reality is that white women do tend to benefit more from diversity and inclusion programs. And women of color tend to still be really left out, and our gender parity is not there. The pay parity, it's not there. So I do feel very deeply versed in how to support women of color leaders to really rise. So I do have openings for that space now. If you're to ask me, I don't know that there's ever a point where I won't center women of color. So even in spaces that feel are open multiculturally and to white women as well, I will still center women of color in that space. And that needs to be a space that people, if I'm generating the program on my own, right? If people are coming and saying, I'm going to do a culture shift agency program, culture shift is really based in centering women of color. And the belief is that the more that we can center women of color, then we will all truly be free, right? Because right now the conversation still, even in the conversations around diversity and inclusion, they're still really benefiting white women predominantly, right? And so we want to be able to shift that narrative.
It's something that I think about so much, in terms of everyone needs to have a space where they feel that they can freely be free And sometimes it means that you do have to segregate yourself off, and then thinking forward when there's going to be a time of total understanding where we're all able to come together and feel that freedom as well. So I'm like, okay, where are we at now? And how close are we to that point? Or are we not there yet? And just even my own experiences within wellness over the years, when I just used to pay like £99 to have a membership at a yoga studio. I rarely saw women of color in the room. Right. I was usually the only one, and it was like that for the majority of time. And even the courses and the trainings that I go to are still, I'm going to be the absolute minority.
Absolutely. And I think that to pretend that is not a dynamic is a disservice, right? Like it's a disservice. And so for me, I counter that by centering my programming around women of color, right? And, to your point around people need to be in spaces where they feel free, right? And also there's a lot of, I operate in a real like pan woman of color, right? But I also would never insert myself in a Black woman only space, right? You need to know where your lane is. And I'm not a Black woman. And sometimes people have made the assumption that I'm a Black woman. And I always correct and just say like, I would love to go, but you need to know that I'm not a Black woman. And then sometimes of course, go back, oh no, girls, women of color, right? And I'm like, okay, great. But I want you to know that because I always want that there's spaces that might just need to be for Black women. Right. And that's okay. That's not about me. That's not about me. There might be spaces that are like, I tend to do all women of color, right? As a grouping, and whoever identifies as such, that's up to you. Right. But I just want to say that because I think it's important that those levels of freedom can be defined differently by different people. And so for some people, it might need to be like, actually, I'm just needing even a subset of women of color in that space, right? And that's okay too, and that there's room for all of that, and that all of that is part of moving us forward, right? That we need our spaces to unpack ourselves and our own stuff and feel safe, to harness our own power to move forward. And a lot of the women I work with tend to operate in predominantly white spaces, right? Because they're either lawyers or they're business owners or, they're in tech. Like they're operating in these spaces that they don't want that replicated in their healing, right? They want their healing to have a different nuance and a different vibration and a different rhythm. And that's valuable and necessary, and we do not need to apologize for that.
I suppose where I'm getting most of mine from is not necessarily predominantly for women of color, but what I'm getting from it is I'm there and I'm thinking I wish more women of color were here. Because and that's how I've always felt every time that when I was in those yoga studios and getting so much just from like, basic hatha yoga class. We weren't necessarily going that deep, but it was kind of like a bit more pop yoga than it was like deep yoga, but just the movement and the connection of my own body, realizing that I was so disconnected or just because it wasn't necessarily taught to me, or the fact that me spending that money, I remember mentioning it to a friend and she was horrified that I was spending that much money, but I'm like, I don't really go out. I don't, you know what I mean? If I kind of tot up all the amounts of money that people spend on their leisure or pleasure, that is actually really quite low. And
to your point, right? I mean, I think that for me, that is why the centering of women of color, even from a marketing perspective, says you're welcome here. This space is for you, right? Because it's countering the dynamic that you're speaking of, and one that I experienced 20 years ago, as a vegan, as a yogi. There was this conversation, oh my God, Marla, you're trying to be so white. And I'm like, why is wellness white? Like, just because I'm actually trying to be healthy, right? And I want to really connect spiritually. But we had really internalized it as things for white people, right? Like yoga is a practice that originated from brown and Black people, right? So it has been fully shifted. You wouldn't know that in this country, but that's really the roots of it. And so I think it's important when you're thinking of like even that yoga, right? The yoga classes that are marketed for people of color, if there's a programming that is specifically going into those communities to provide some kind of just even access, because if you do not see yourself in those spaces, you do not think that you are welcome.
Yeah.
Right. And so and that's an important piece to remember. Right. And so then what do we do to counter that? What does our programming do to counter that dynamic? How do we market to counter that dynamic? And as someone who has had that experience, right, like I shared in Colombia in a predominantly white space, what that did to my psyche, right? Being in yoga studios where I was one of a few people of color, being in a health food store that was one of a few people of color. You know what I mean? It was just that's something that I've had to just continue to dismantle over and over and over again and say, I'm committed to my wellness. And I'm committed to being fully sustainable in the way in which I operate, the way in which I live. And I'm not going to be in this rat race that you have insisted that we be on as a system. And I think it's important to add that different countries have different paradigms, right? Like the US has a very specific construct that we have to operate in here. And so I think it's important, like in the part of the world that you are in the UK, my understanding is that the conversation and the narrative isn't so much about women of color, right? Like people aren't necessarily in the space of thinking that there's a real need for it. But yet, when I speak to women of color, there's a real need for it.
Yeah.
Right? But that's still not in the psyche of the country yet. Right. And so it's something to be conscious of and be like, what part of the wave do you want to be on?
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, definitely not to, I mean, you're coming over here in a month or so anyway. So, but not to the extent that we see it or portrayed in the States as well. And I think that's always been something that has been very different in the way that the colour lines are set out in our respective countries. In the UK, it just kind of, there isn't so much of a breaking day. It doesn't feel like that anyway. It just always seems like there's more in America. Yeah. I'm sure you know some of the people that I would name from over here that are doing the work as well, because there's so few. So you know what I mean? We all know each other. Anyway, I want to ask you her conversations questions. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, what is the best piece of advice a woman has ever given to you?
You know, it's a great question to look at. One of the best pieces of advice, I was 23 or 24 years old, and I was working, it was at my time in New York, and I was working at a center called the Dominican Women's Development Center. And I had interned there, and when I graduated, I became their associate director for development. And I was navigating a lot with the board of directors of the organization. And one of the sisters, two Latinas at separate times actually, pulled me aside because they knew I was going to be getting married the following year. And they said, listen, if you don't want to have kids, don't have them. And it was a moment where I was like, what? And they said, you know, I just want to let you know, like as Latinas, that is right after marriage, it's the next question is, when are you having babies, right? Like that is so deeply expected of us. And I want you to know that you don't have to have them if you don't want to. Like you need to absolutely want to, because it will totally change your life. And for a long time, I didn't know if I did, you know, and then the executive director pulled me aside. I was like, listen, you don't have to have kids. So it was this moment of time where like a few elder, like, they weren't even elders at that point. They were just older than I was, right? Maybe 10, 15 years, and saying, hey, I love my kids, but I don't really love kids. So you've got to figure out like whether you want to do this, because it will totally change your life. And for me, the conversation wasn't about having kids or not have kids. And I do have 12-year-old twins. The conversation became about, don't buy into what society is telling you that you need to do and what our culture is telling you that your life needs to look like. You get to define it. Right. And so that was great advice, because that's really what I took away from the conversation. Our culture is going to tell you lots of things that may not be in your best interest individually. You get to decide.
So true. And like, you know, and cultures, like you say, Latina women, it's expected of them to have children, and also from Caribbean and Western, also, you know, and me as like on the other side of 45 should have like, what are you doing? You know, like I'm just not there yet. You know, it's sometimes you've got to wait for your life to play out the way it's got to play out, and sometimes it just looks very different than what other people do. And also you have to hold your own for what is working for you and what isn't. Which woman would you say represents higher energetic resonance to you?
You know, it's interesting. I was thinking about contemporaries in that, with that conversation. And so I would say Tracy Stanley feels like that to me. There's a sister, Laren Alta, who's also like a spiritual kind of guide and healer, and she's amazing. Those were the two that came up to me right away as women who have been deeply living these truths for 20 years, that I'm like, oof, their energy is here, right? I think of my mentor, Asana Makaru, who was the first elder who really kind of helped me carve my own way, you know, in deep spiritual practices. Yeah, I'd start with those three.
Beautiful. And what are your favorite rituals and self-care practices?
I talked about it a little bit in the beginning, being in circles of women. Having a sister circle here is really important to me. And having moved recently to Atlanta, having to build a community that is open to that has been really lovely. I love having my hands in the dirt. So I love to garden, and that's something that I did a lot when I lived in New York, in upstate New York, about 7 years ago. I grew a lot of our food, and then we moved to Texas for my husband's job, and I wasn't growing anything. And so now to be back in a place where we have a home, where there's a yard where I can like get my hands dirty, that feels really, really good to me. It's such a, it's an exhale for me. So that's great. And then I really start my day intentionally. You know, if I'm really on it, I feel like I get up before everybody, but that feels kind of rare and in between, because I do like the quiet and the darkness. But if not, I wait till everybody leaves and goes to work or to school, and I will light my candles. I put on a station that's heart meditations, and do some stretching and yoga and light incense or sage and meditate. So those are ways for me that every day feels like a real grounding practice.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. What's coming up next for you?
So there's a few things. As I mentioned, I'm doing the event in London on June 2nd, and then the Pause and Press Play on June 21st to the 23rd. But this month and next, I'm actually working on a book proposal. So I am working on a book that explores rituals for leadership, right? Because I think that what we need at this point is to be really healed and whole in order to be the best leaders that we can be. And we need our leaders to be healed and whole. And unfortunately, I feel that we're seeing how so many of our leaders are not. And so that's what I'm working on. And so my intention is that that I will write a book about rituals for leadership.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. So when do you think you might release that? You're looking at?
You know, I'm looking, once May rolls around and I finish this proposal, I'll be sending it to different publishers. So I don't know. Right now it feels like this dream or prayer that I'm working on every day, and that I'm getting messages on every day, and I'm able to look at my life and the leaders that I work with and see what has been the most resonant. And for me, invoking the sacred is a way to disrupt corporations. It's a way to disrupt capitalism. Invoking the sacred as separate from religion, but about the sanctity of us and our own individual wholeness. So, you know, to be determined, to be continued. I don't know yet when it'll come out. I haven't gotten that clear. But what is clear is that I'm writing and I'm working on the proposal. So, you know, stay tuned.
Yeah, of course. I just wish you all the best with that. It just sounds, you know, when someone kind of mentions a book and it's going to be like this, you just like want to read it already. It just sounds So juicy, and like you say, a ritual around leadership just sounds. There's so many things that I feel that come up when you say that, and one of the things is kind of the sense of purpose and humility around leadership, where, you know, a lot of the time when you look at the examples of leadership, it seems almost like there's an entitlement to the, you know, an entitlement and a way to like kind of cast orders and a suppression of the people, as opposed to let's kind of gather everyone up together and also communicate that you understand where they've been because you've been there as a leader. So yeah, I'll keep looking out for it, don't worry.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And where can people find you?
Yeah, so I think that one of the best ways right now, there's two, is one on Instagram. So my Instagram handle is Marla Teyolia. That's MarlaTeyolia. And then my website is cultureshift.agency. And on there, you can sign up under the Work With Me Individually section. You can sign up, and then you're given a document around identifying your values, and that'll be sent to you automatically, but that'll put you on my newsletter list. And so that's where you'll hear about different things that are happening, right? So actually today or tomorrow, the newsletter will be going out where I'm opening slots for complimentary calls for anybody who's interested in coaching. And those will happen this week and then move into next week. And then you'll get information on my retreats and any corporate offerings. So those two, I would say, are the best ways to get a hold of me.
That's perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Marla.
Yes,
thank you so much for this conversation. And I got so much tips and just great to speak to you. And hopefully, because it's only like a couple of weeks away, well, no, 5-6 weeks away, when you're in town.
Very quickly. So I'm partnering with High Life Yoga. She's based in Brixton, and I wish I could say exactly where the location is, but she's coordinating that. So not that I know London, so I don't even want to say where it is, but we have a space. And it'll be on Sunday, June 2nd from 3 to 6. So I'll make sure to tag you on Instagram.
Yeah, just keep me posted.
The promo app.
Share it. Sure. And I've got a newsletter, I've got a newsletter list as well. So a lot of my newsletter receivers are in the UK and London based as well. So it's always a possibility that, they might come down and see you that way. So
that would be great.
Perfect. And also, I can personally come and like touch you like in reality.
Yes, that would be amazing.
It'd be great, because I don't get often to meet the people, the women that I speak to. So, to be in real life.
That would be amazing.
IRL as it is in
that's right.
online space right now. Let's get with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What an honor and a blessing to connect with you.
Perfect. I'll speak to you soon.
Take care.
You. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks to Marla for joining me on this episode of Her Conversations, and thank you for listening. You can discover more about me by visiting my website on carolmaywhittick.com. That's carolmaewhittick.com. Also, Her Life Academy is now open. If you're listening to this before June 1st, 2019, there's still an opportunity to experience everything for free. Yes, that's free. If you go to www.herlifeacademy.com and sign up. Full membership prices start on the 1st of June 2019 going forward. So if you get in before that, not only will you be able to experience the Academy for free, but you'll be also privy to a special bonus for launch members only. You can also find Her Life Academy on Instagram. It's at Her Life Academy. And for my own personal social media, I'm on Facebook under Carol May Whittick, and my Instagram is Casmic. So that's at Casmic, at CAZMICK. And also, I'd appreciate you leaving a comment, liking, sharing any episodes, and subscribing on your preferred platform so that you'll be notified as soon as a new episode gets published. So until next week, thank you again for listening and have a great week.